Lepo pozdravljeni. A lahko prosim zasedete sedeže? Can you please take your seats? Thank you. And the media, please take care. Media, prosim, pazite, tlele bo prišla predsednica. And now I would like to welcome the President of the Republic, Nataša Briški, Vice President of the European Commission, Věra Jourová, and Ukrainian Ambassador Andrii Taran. Prosim, pozdravite, v dvorano prihaja predsednica države, Nataša Briški.
So joining us are the President of the Republic of Slovenia, Mrs. Nataša Briški, Vice President of the European Commission, Mrs. Jourová, and the Ambassador of Ukraine to Slovenia, Mr. Andrii Taran.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning and welcome. Distinguished Madam President of the Republic of Slovenia, Mrs. Nataša Briški, Distinguished Vice President of the European Commission, Mrs. Věra Jourová, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Ukraine to Slovenia, Mr. Andrii Taran, distinguished guests. 1 year after the beginning of the unprovoked Russian aggression on Ukraine, we can say that the European Union, with the support to Ukrainian nation, its fight against Russian aggression, has shown unity and solidarity. So far, the European Union has allocated for Ukraine about 50 billion euro in financial, humanitarian, and military aid. Recently, we have approved the 10th package of sanctions in order to further increase the pressure on Russia. However, the fight for democracy and freedom is not only taking place in the Ukrainian cities and villages, but also in the media and in the public opinion. Disinformation campaigns are increasingly complementing military operations, and this is why one of the priorities of the European Commission is preventing the spreading of fake news, undermining democratic processes, and creating artificial divisions in the public. Free and independent media are one of the most solid bastions against disinformation. Last year, the European Commission proposed the European Media Freedom Act, through which it is trying to further strengthen editorial independence and make sure that the public media can function normally. This is what we are going to discuss today here in the EU House, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome such prominent speakers, but I would also like to thank all those of you joining us here in the EU House and online. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hvala lepa tudi vam.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jerneja Jug Jerše, Head of the European Commission Representation Office here in Slovenia. Now, welcome on my behalf as well. The title of this roundtable is The Free Media, a Bastion Against Disinformation at Times of War. As was mentioned a year ago, Russia attacked Ukraine. We have 8 million displaced persons, thousands of dead. But at the same time, there is also a battle for the narrative. There is plenty of information and disinformation, and sometimes it is difficult to know what is true and what is not. So I'm going to talk with my guest about information, manipulation with information at a time of war, and the role of the free media. Also, I would like to hear what are the answers of the European Commission. Madam President, Madam Vice President, and Mr. Ambassador, welcome. Let me start with you, Madam President. You started as a journalist. Now, disinformation has always been with us. This is not something that has appeared overnight. However, with online media, we have seen disinformation accelerating their pace. So, do you think that we are losing control of disinformation? First of all, good morning, and Jerneja, thank you for welcoming us here in the EU House. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to be the speaker together with Madam Jourová. We met several years ago. She was the commissioner for a different portfolio, and we discussed different topics. But thank you, Madam Vice President, for coming to Slovenia. Now, Nataša, you established yourself. Disinformation is not something that has appeared overnight. We all agree that disinformation is now distributed much faster. If you want to check the digital library of the Slovenian University Library, and if you go and check the news from 1907, you will see that that's quite interesting reading, and you will see what was happening back then. But today, we have people who do not read conservative, traditional media, and therefore this issue has been further exacerbated. Now, by way of introduction, I would like to talk about the problem of impact of disinformation on people through the social media. Just remember, 5-6 years ago, or even more, there was a big scandal called Cambridge Analytica. And that was the first shock for Europe as well, for the EU, where we first learned in what way somebody can order a service from this big data manager and how they can impact the psyche of people. What did Cambridge Analytica do? When Donald Trump and Mr. Biden were candidates, no, it was Mr. Trump and Hillary Clinton. Yes, it was a woman. I apologize. So back then, what happened was the following. Cambridge Analytica received a backdoor entrance on Facebook without the public knowing about it, without Facebook user being informed about it. Cambridge Analytica profiled people according to their conviction. Are they supporters of Democrats or Republicans? And what they wanted to do was to influence the public opinion. Through this type of advertising and spreading of disinformation, they targeted a group of voters, and I think it was 83 million people influenced by its messages that were used to impact the voters. Why am I giving you this example? Because I think spreading disinformation can harm countries that believe in the rule of law. And this is something that the EU is monitoring very closely. Please allow me to mention that I am immensely pleased to live in the EU, the leading force in regulating modern IT, and also raising the awareness of the rest of the planet. Together with the Council of Europe and EU member states, we are now becoming a very important player. We are trying to find out how we can raise the awareness among people, not just about disinformation, but also about the importance of the development of digital services or social media. how big a problem this is. Do you believe that we are exaggerating? No, I don't think we are. And if I have an opportunity later on, I will give you another example. But it is a problem. And it was a problem 100 years ago. I'm not saying it wasn't. But due to the speed with which the information is spreading, and also because hybrid warfare, which is being used by third countries against countries that they don't agree with, this is why this is a problem that we should and must speak about. Madam Vice President, the Russian attack on Ukraine is accompanied by a very extensive disinformation campaign. Now, a personal question, how do you make a distinction? I know that you are here as the Vice President of the European Commission, but how does Věra Jourová know what is true and what she's going to believe and what she's not going to believe?
Thank you very much. I will start with one absolutely strong truth, how happy I am to be here today with you and have this opportunity to discuss with the President and with the Ambassador and with you here. How do I define the truth for myself? I will start with the definition of disinformation, which is a verifiable lie. And for me, the facts are facts. They have to be verified. They have to be based on evidence. This is why we need the professional independent media to bring the facts, because the journalists are the people who can search for the facts and deliver them to the users and to the readers. And at the same, so the facts are objective and they belong to everybody. The opinions are individual, are subjective. So I might surprise you. I don't think that disinformation is something which sounds uncomfortable to me. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Uncomfortable opinions must be protected by the freedom of speech. So this is how I differentiate, and I try to embed this differentiation into different documents, also to the EU legislation. And Věra Jourová is a Czech woman who was born in Czechoslovakia, which was occupied by the Soviet army almost 21 years. And we were living in information fog. There was just one doctrine dictated from Kremlin those times, 21 years. So I am extremely sensitive now about how to say. I really try to propose the proper reaction also on the flood of Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation, the production of the disinformation coming from the aggressor in this horrible war. Disinformation obviously is a part of the Russian military arsenal. And in fact, this information war started with the annexation on Crimea. Already from 2014, we see from the data which we are collecting that there was a long-lasting effort of Russia to prepare the ground for the invasion. They tried to convince the Europeans that Ukrainians are the nation which is not nation. Ukrainians are the people who are maybe people, but who are Nazis, who do not deserve any kind of protection. And Putin invested billions in this campaigning in European member states. The campaign was stronger in the east of Europe, in some states especially, a weaker thing in the west of Europe, but it was present and it did not bear fruits because immediately after the invasion in February last year, the support for Russia dropped to 3-5%. Even in the countries where there was some kind of historical sympathy with Russia. So we are in the war, we are in the information war. We had to do three things to strengthen the fight against disinformation / war propaganda. So now we have a special agreement with the digital platforms that they will monitor the space and that they will remove the cases of manifestly clear cases of the Russian war propaganda. The second thing, we had to start sanctioning the so-called media, but Russia Today and Sputnik were assessed as not media anymore, but just the weapons. So we are now sanctioning these so-called media, not only Russia Today and Sputnik, but several others. The last edition of the sanctions package also contained some concrete propagandists and some so-called media. And the third thing which we try to do now is to support the Russian journalists in exile who live in EU countries. We have 3 main hubs of places where they live and try to work. It's Riga, it's Amsterdam, and it's Prague. And I announced the initiative, which I labeled or called Radio Free Russia. And we are supporting them to do the job, to develop the content, and to get the content onto the Russian Federation territory. So in a nutshell, these are the things we are doing. The role of the independent media is absolutely essential. And sometimes when I ask the journalists, could you please help in the fight against disinformation, sometimes I hear from the journalists, you want to instrumentalize us. And my answer is yes, sorry, but we need you to do the job properly and to deliver the facts to the people.
Že v najavi te okrogle mize so bile.
When announcing this round table, we have received some very vivid reaction. You mentioned Russia Today and Sputnik as a Russia propaganda machinery. And I have seen how many likes you got online. So can you tell us?
Well, I received one from Kremlin when I openly said in, I think, February 2020 that Russia and China are the main producers of the disinformation, brainwashing us in Europe. I appeared on the Russian sanctions list. So this was a big like I got from Kremlin.
Gospod ambasador, če lahko malo poveste.
Mr. Ambassador, a week ago, we commemorated the first sad anniversary of aggression on your country. And there have been some assessments of the damage to the infrastructure, victims, displaced persons. How do you assess the damage because of disinformation?
Well, first of all, let me greet everyone here, Madam President, Madam Vice President. Thank you very much for having me here. This is a very important issue for our country. From the very beginning of this terrible war, we have seen the evidences of how Russia is using disinformation and propaganda against our country. I was admiring with the success of their propaganda before the war started. They were great in propaganda in their own country. As a result, we can see the percentage of support to this terrible war in Russia. There is absolutely no way for Russians to escape from that propaganda. Everywhere, on every TV, on every news media channel, in the internet, they just cut it and other sources of information. They just put it all, that propaganda and disinformation efforts toward, first of all, their own population. Then we have seen the results of disinformation and propaganda in 2014. Well, not always it was smart. Sometimes it was really very stupid, but people believed in it. Like, for example, they said, we are not there. These green people with no insignia are from somewhere. they are not Russians. Even when they surrounded the parliament of Crimea and used their weapon to make those so-called parliamentarians to vote to proclaim Crimea as a part of Russian Federation, it was obvious it is disinformation, this is propaganda, but people in Russia believed in it because they were taught to believe whatever is said by Russian channels. For us, it was very important to bring the truth to the world community, to show that this is not true. This is really disinformation. Then it was another huge wave of disinformation in Donbass, where so-called miners and farmers somehow, from somewhere, get their weapon, get even tanks, get heavy artillery, machine guns, everything needed to fight against regular armed forces of Ukraine. And once again, the explanation was, in my view, stupid and unrealistic. Well, those miners and farmers purchased somewhere that weapon. They found it somewhere in the mines. And people in Russia really believed, well, it's not us, once again. Then there were many terrible stories about how cruel are Ukrainian soldiers, how cruel are the armed forces of Ukraine. I believe you still remember those stories about crucified boy in some news media in Russia. It was 3 years boy who was crucified by Ukrainians. In some other stories, it was 6 years boy, and even Russian media didn't believe in it. But the story was organized in order to show, first of all, once again, to the Russian population and to the civilized war, look, those Ukrainians are really cruel people. They're against any humanity. And that time, I believe, was the first time when civilized war recognized it is really propaganda, it is disinformation. There were many true stories published by Western journalists who came to the Donbass area in order to find out what's going on there. Who are really fighting against regular Ukrainian armed forces? I can give you another example of how successful was their propaganda or how it was not successful. That time I was Lieutenant General. I was first deputy of the command of the ground forces of Ukraine. And I was assigned to Donbass to lead the Ukrainian part of Joint Center for Control and Coordination, the role of which supposed to be to verify how Minsk agreements are implemented by both sides, by Russians and by Ukrainians. In order to verify this, to the body of that 𝗍𝗵𝗂𝗁𝗍 was included a part of Russian military, headed by a Russian general. And when they see how successful are our efforts when we try to bring the truth about who is guilty in all those violations of Minsk negotiations, Minsk agreements in Donbass area, they called me in their media hawk of war, and they tried to find the way how to undermine my influence, how to discredit that Ukrainian general. And they were able to hack the official site, the official web page of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council. And one day I was shocked when my press officer told me, General, I don't know, we receive many calls from many journalists. What should I say? I said, about what? Take a look at that web page of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, the official web page. I took a look and I was really shocked. I saw running words. General Taran was accused in the state treason, was dismissed from all the positions, and was arrested. I said, well, I'm still not arrested. I don't know what it's all about. I immediately called Kyiv. I called some high-level officials and said, what does it mean? What are you talking about, General? I said, about that statement, which is on the official web page of the National Security and Defense Council. They took a look and said, well, this is nonsense. This is, we cannot, it is fake. It's definitely fake. It is just to undermine your position, to discredit you as a person, as a general, as a head of Ukrainian group in 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗃. I said, well, let's do it, something. Then the Secretary of National Security and Defense Council made official statement. It was published. It was in our mass media sources. They said, this is fake. This is attempt to hack, successful attempt to hack the web page. But can you imagine how many journalists, even in our Ukrainian mass media, posted this statement when they saw the official web page? It brings us to another important issue about the necessity of paying attention to the cybersecurity.
Ja, in točno tukaj bi rada.
Indeed, and this is where I want to continue. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Madam President, in your introduction, you touched upon this. In your career, you have dealt with this topic. Democracy is a plurality of opinions. This is something that we encourage and support. But on the other hand, we can see that online platforms and the social media are turning into systems which use algorithms and promote the spreading of vivid debates. We see disinformation is spreading sooner, quicker than ever. So do you think that those platforms should be more responsible in terms of what they are distributing and sharing, or do you think that we should leave it and the market is going to find an answer? Well, personally, I believe that we cannot leave it to the market. This is the past. Although, if you listen, Elon Musk and Twitter, as soon as Elon Musk took over, he fired everybody that was dealing with the removal of illegal content. Personally, I believe this is not good. Personally, I am very hopeful when it comes to the Digital Services Act. And once again, the EU is at the very forefront of the efforts in this area. Now, the Digital Services Act, and Madam Vice President, please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know it in more detail. Now, the drafters of the Act made a clear distinction between illegal content and harmful content. And please believe me that the EU is always trying to strike a balance between several human rights, and the freedom of expression has always been very high on the EU agenda. Now, when it comes to illegal contents, consensus was found very quickly. We all know pedophile contents are illegal and it has to be removed immediately. However, when we come to harmful contents, including disinformation, unchecked information, defamation. There, the EU left it to the member states to make a judgment what, based on the national legislation, is harmful, and in which cases the affected individuals or organizations have the right to legal remedies. And I'm very happy to know that the EU is aware of all the different rights and freedoms. But you might remember that years ago, as an information commissioner, I talked about not just the social media. As gatekeepers, they all have more than 10 million users, which is a threshold for the digital services. But I talked about the responsibility of the traditional media as well, including the internet. In Slovenia, we also had a debate, and here we have a role for the member states. The media should have rules, so-called community rules. Every medium should have certain rules when it comes to fora as well. So there should be some editorial influence as well. And I think this is very important, because if you go on a forum, you can have an article and you can know in advance what the reaction will be. Disinformation, defamation, and so on and so forth. Insults of all sorts of things. So I think that here we should do more. The media should do more, because the Digital Services Act also says that introducing a content
splet, ker to bi bilo kontra temu, v kar Evropska unija verjame, da pa vendarle ta akt apelira na vse, da pregledujejo vsebine.
However, this act appeals on everybody to check the content. There is the doctrine notice on action. So if you are informed, do react if you see that the content is illegal. So there, we can act very quickly. And if you have to prove disinformation, there will be procedures at the member states level. Of course, it's a longer procedure. However, here it is member states that have a role to play. And if you ask me, media should be the first to act. And it is not a good idea that Elon Musk has neglected this. I have been watching Facebook, and Facebook is firing people who are in charge of reacting whenever illegal content is notified. It's not a step in the right direction. And just one more sentence. Mr. Ambassador and Madam Vice President mentioned disinformation and the Russian propaganda. In my introduction, I briefly mentioned that this is part of hybrid warfare, and this is something that NATO is also fully aware of. NATO has reaction forces watching what is happening online, but I can tell you what I talked about with the Moldavian president. It has been published in the media, yes, and we all know that they are very nervous because of the war. Indeed, they are fully aware that Ukraine is defending itself, but also them, and they are fully aware that Moldova is one of the countries that is being targeted, one of the countries where they are trying to impact the public opinion. But what is happening in Moldova is that people are already on the streets. It's not a joke anymore. Due to disinformation and also due to cooperation with pro-Russian Serbs, we have seen incidents where some Serbian football supporters have been trying to go to Moldova and cause unrest. Do not forget, Russian propaganda can not only be found in Ukraine, but also in Moldova, in Western Balkans countries, and China and Russia working together are trying to seize this vacuum, this space in the global south, Latin America, Africa, so across the planet, horrible things are happening, and Maia Sandu is extremely concerned about what is happening in Moldova. And I myself, I am quite concerned because we are quite close to the region, being also neighbors to the Western Balkan. I don't know if you read it, but Russia Today, mentioned by Madam Commissioner, has opened its outlet in Belgrade. Russia Today has its outlet there. Serbia is not a member of the EU. They don't have to abide by the EU regulations. They could, but they don't. So the Russia was very quick to react, and the story in Western Balkans is very different. Do you know what the main income of Russia Today in Belgrade is in terms of marketing? The main advertiser is the Wagner Group. So it's not a joke, and that's not a disinformation. Well, you can see it. You can see Russia Today is present in Belgrade, and Wagner is advertising. So probably they're not doing it for a joke. They are recruiting soldiers at the Western Balkans.
Ms. Jourová, Madam President mentioned the Digital Services Act. In Slovenia, too, there was an attack on public media, and this triggered the initiative on the Free Media Act. Could you be a bit more specific about disinformation on the Ukrainian war? Which type of disinformation is the most harmful, and what are you doing to block these disinformation? Yes. What do you do?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I have to say I'm so impressed by the depth of your knowledge, Madam President, of these things, because I'm
addicted to this.
Well, you seem to be in a positive way. I often speak to the presidents of the countries, and we usually keep on a very general level. Which kind of disinformation? I will come to that, but one.
Go ahead.
2 comments on what you asked His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, before. What damage can be caused? The damage which can be caused in the EU is, or will be, when the Russian propaganda will start winning the elections in our countries. That's why. What do we do against against the disinformation, not only produced in Russia, but in general, is the purpose of what we are doing is to protect elections as a main democratic thing, and the second, to protect security. So we are not dealing with this information just because we don't like lying, but these are the 2 things: elections and security. And as for the elections, part of it is the action against the method which Madam President mentioned, the Cambridge Analytica, now the new Israeli project 𝗀𝗁𝗄𝗁, which tries to influence the voters in a hidden way, the manipulation through very sophisticated technological way. So this is really big fear, and the damage which I mentioned when Russian propaganda will start winning. Of course, they cannot win directly, but they have proxies. They have allies in our EU member states. They have political powers, political parties, political figures who are ready to fly on people's fear and uncertainty, who are ready to sell peace.
Mađarski predsjednik pošilja pozdrave.
The Hungarian president is sending his greetings.
It's a special case. I speak about the elections to come. This year, there are elections in Slovakia, in Bulgaria, in Spain. There is a huge wave of disinformation whenever something between the government and the Catalan government is happening. Yes, so this is something which I fear most. And here we have to do more. Which kind of disinformation against Ukraine? Well, as I said already, after 2014, it started. There were some periods when we measured almost 40% of the scope of disinformation, especially in Eastern countries, relating to Ukraine. I mentioned some of them, Mr. Ambassador, also. In general, the messages that...
also against the EU.
Yes, of course, but the question was about Ukraine. So to picture the Ukrainians as those who really do not deserve any mercy, any protection, people with no moral, with taking drugs, Nazis, all these things. Yes, they are stupid, but some people believe that. And so we are now collecting the data which from the platforms, which also show the narratives. They are changing over time. Of course, these are basic things, but the narrative which is not only spread in the EU, but mainly in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, is that the high prices of food is because we are blocking the food and wheat export from Ukraine. And this is dangerous, and we have to counter that. We have new data now from the big platforms which told us that they are doing what we want them to do, to demonetize the disinformers. So only Google cut off the money, those traditional channels by 13 million euro in the last few months. We have data showing how many fake accounts and bots they removed. And here we speak about removal. The production of robots is not protected by the freedom of speech. Yes, so we see that the platforms are doing a lot, but as Madam President said, this must be work at the member states level, because to counter disinformation and hate speech, it requires the knowledge of language and the knowledge of the decisions of the courts, how they define, national courts, how they define what is lie and what is hate speech, which must be removed because it is criminal content. And here we have to push more the big platforms, because they are still not employing enough experts in those small countries or smaller countries' languages, and they have been neglecting the East of Europe heavily over years. So I am pushing them to do more.
Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, in your career, you have also been the defense minister in Ukraine. You were a high-ranking officer of the Ukrainian armed forces. You were trained to act in war with traditional warfare, but traditional warfare is no longer applicable when it comes to disinformation. Now, what is your role as the ambassador? What orientation have you received from Kiev? What to do in these cases?
Well, this is actually not just my task. This is, I would say, the main task for every embassy everywhere in the world. The task in telling the truth about the country. This is what we are trying to do here in Ljubljana. With all my diplomats, we are trying to deliver the truth about what is going on in Ukraine. In every meeting with people, with officials, with the representatives of diplomatic corps, we are trying to deliver the truth about what is really going on in Ukraine. At the same time, speaking about the national policy, I would like to add a few words. in Ukraine, we pay a lot of attention to this fight, to this struggle against the disinformation. There were several structures created in Ukraine. Some are governmental, some are NGOs, like Stop Fake, and at the level of government, there is a structure called Center for Strategic Communication and Security. We are trying to stop dispersing disinformation within our country also. Because it is not secret that before the invasion, the full-scale invasion, there were many pro-Russians, pro-Russian organizations, pro-Russian people, and in many cases there were agents of Russia trying to undermine our society from the inside. Even in our parliament, there were several so-called people deputies who were there due to Russian financial support. Now they escaped from Ukraine. Some knew probably about the full-scale invasion before it starts, and they flew from Ukraine a week or 10 days ago, just before this invasion started. But those guys were paid by Russians. And I read many stories how many Russian spies were caught by counterintelligence in many Western countries as well. And we know that in some countries, the so-called cultural centers of Russia were used as a center for spying within the countries, for providing the disinformation, misinformation, defamation, all that stuff within European community countries. And we really appreciate the decision of Slovenian government, first of all, which paid serious attention to this. They expelled several Russian spies who were under coverage of diplomatic immunity here in Ljubljana. They closed that Russian cultural center. And it seems to me, I completely agree, that in every Western country, in every European Union country, there should be certain decision and political will to do whatever is possible to prevent further existence of centers for disinformation in the countries. And I think that the role of embassies, the role of ambassadors and also diplomats is difficult to overestimate. Thank you.
Ko smo že pri tem, slovenski voditelji...
Speaking about this, Slovenian leaders and people support Ukraine in its struggle for freedom. Nevertheless, many prominent intellectuals published a letter recently, a public letter, Stop the War. There are people in Slovenia who are convinced that the current situation was caused either by the US actions or by the EU actions. Now, what do you think about this? Do you think that your work here in Slovenia is different from your colleagues in the Baltic states, in Poland, for instance? I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong.
First of all, let me say that here in Slovenia, the democracy is democracy. You are not authoritarian states. You do not have any dictatorship in your country. So we can see all the signs of democracy here in Slovenia. That is why these statements can appear with no punishment. It is democracy. That's true. Another thing is it true statements? Is it really what these intellectuals think, or it was somehow influenced from and by pro-Russian circles? I don't know. You should decide. It's your decision. But I already commented this to some journalists here in Slovenia, that I was told by some Slovenians that these statements, such words, just represent the way of thinking of these people, the way of their mentality. And it looks like they still live under the influence of former Yugoslavia. They still think in old-fashioned way. They just say what was appropriate that time. And if they continue to keep that way of thinking, that way of understanding what's going on in the world, well, it's shame, but it is up to them. This is democracy. Thank you.
Ja, hvala lepa. V vašo informacijo zgolj še to, da zadnjih 5 let.
Thank you. The last 15 minutes of this discussion will be devoted to the question and answers session. You can also raise questions through Slido and Facts Matter hashtag. Madam Ambassador, you have hosted an event to mark the first anniversary of the war. And at this event, the spouse of Mr. Zelensky featured in a video address. She emphasized that one shouldn't be indifferent. It seems that the disinformation campaigns are tackling this question as well. So what should we do in order not to be indifferent? Well, this is a question that we always ask ourselves at any war. During the first month, you have the news on every first page, and then this slowly fails to appear on the first pages, and slowly you don't read about it any longer. But as a president of the Republic, I can say that the politicians are responsible for drawing attention to these actions, to make sure that this is still featuring on the first pages, and it is important that EU is united. I don't know anybody who would be able to claim that there are no hard feelings. Yes, there are hard feelings from the past, but how to overcome that? That is the $1 million question. Everybody, the presidents, heads of governments and states, the EU, we are all talking about this. But at the end of the day, it is Ukraine who decided to defend itself. And the task of the responsible politicians is to help the country who has been subject to this awful aggression. And we know who aggressor is. And this does not only refer to military aid. We are a relatively small country, but we feature high among donors. And what Madam Zelensky said was that she admires solidarity and compassion of people. Slovenians know what it feels like to be in war, and I touch wood. We experienced only a 10-day war for independence, whereas Ukrainians have been in war for a whole year. But this really selfless support to Ukraine, for Ukraine, this is something that is highly appreciated by Ukraine. I often receive thanks from the President Zelensky. We talk about this with His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador. You know, people managed to collect millions of euro apart from the aid sent by the state. But we need to be vigilant. These things must remain at the forefront of people's attention. We must must inform people about what is going on. This is our duty. This is our responsibility. And to conclude, Ukraine decided to defend itself. Slovenia would do the same. Imagine the situation when Slovenia is attacked by someone as big as Russia. Everybody would shout, "Help us, please," and we would receive help. I am quite convinced, and that is why Ukraine deserves help as well. And it is on Ukraine to decide on which position it will start negotiations. That is the decision of Ukraine itself. Ukraine should define its negotiating positions with Russia. But there are no negotiations without Ukraine. The EU may help. Madam von der Leyen is trying its best. President Macron, the Chancellor Merkel, they were talking about problems following Crimea. So I cannot accept the thesis that the EU doesn't do enough for peace. This is not correct. This is not just.
Yes, did you want to make a comment?
Well, first of all, I forgot to thank the Slovenian people for solidarity and compassion which you showed.
Thank you.
From the start of the invasion of Russia to Slovenia, to Ukraine. And I wanted to react on what you mentioned, the letter calling for peace. And I think that we all want peace. I don't know anyone who would say, I want war, anyone from within the EU states. We all cry for victims. We almost all admire the heroism of the Ukrainian people, and I want to thank Ukraine for such a strong reaction, which is always a reaction done on behalf of all of us, because I do believe that Ukrainians are fighting also for us and for our values. But coming back to the peace, we should learn from the history. Appeasement never paid off. And I have to remind us of 1938, when part of Czechoslovakia was taken out on the basis of the Munich Agreement. It was Hitler, French President 𝗷𝗲𝗄, and the British Chancellor Chamberlain. And it was the effort from Great Britain and France to avoid the war. And what Churchill said afterwards, you wanted peace and fame, and now you have war and shame. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is the lesson we should bear in mind. Because if we now push Ukraine to conclude with some kind of, I call it dirty peace, not just peace, but dirty peace, with the concessions given to the aggressor will want more. Putin will always want more. And here comes Moldova. Here comes, of course, a big nervousness in Baltic Sea countries. Yes. And so we have to be tough at this moment and leave it for the Ukrainians and President Zelensky and his people to decide where is the time to sit around the table and who with.
Mm-hmm. A lahko samo dodam eno stvar. V tem segmentu, o katerem se zdaj pogovarjamo, seveda ne gre za dezinformacijo.
Well, we are not talking about disinformation here, if I may add. It's not about hate speech. We are talking about accepting a difference of opinions and a culture of dialogue. And this is also very important in this war. Of course, we'll always have a variety of opinions. However, it is our duty to speak about the things that matter to Slovenia, the EU, and the world. And we also have to speak to people who have a different opinion. But that's not disinformation, it's just a different view. At the end of the day, we might agree that we don't agree, but we need to talk about it. Indeed, but there is certain information that will bring you to certain conclusions. Madam Vice President, a question for you. In the context of the Ukraine war, we see that information is being distorted to reduce the support of the EU for Ukraine. At the same time, we see that there are certain issues that are being further exacerbated, such as energy crisis, costs, migrants. We know that this story for the narrative is very tough. According to your analysis, which parts of the EU are the most or the least susceptible for disinformation? And is this in any way related to the health of the public media in this country?
I would not like to name and shame, but it's true that we see extreme effort of Russia in Slovakia and Bulgaria, where we already now see that there is quite big part of the society which has some maybe historical given also sympathy towards Russia. And this is important to understand, that each nation has some history, some sentiments, some basic instincts. And Russian propagandists who know how to do their job perfectly well, as the ambassador said, they have a very good analysis of where is the fertile ground for their efforts. This is also a matter of money and capacities, and simply it's cheaper in some countries to achieve bigger results. So this is what we see from our data. But what you also said, that there is some kind of disinformation connected with the energy crisis and prices of food and migration. This is not always disinformation what we read. Well, the truth is that we are going through big energy crisis. This winter seems to be okay. We have enough gas and we managed to get over this winter. Still, one winter is ahead of us, and we have to be telling the people the truth. And who are we? We who are governing. The people in power, the Democrats, have to also change something in the strategic communication and to maybe prepare the people for bad things and have courage to say unpopular things, unpopular truth. And I believe the people will understand. While I see in some countries, and also I have to say, I have to be self-critical with us working for the EU, that we have a tendency, well, to draw a rosy picture and not to say the full truth, and sometimes to avoid answers. There is a high level of uncertainty and nervousness in the society, and we have to be more open and more honest with the citizens, and they will understand. The second thing is to
public media.
make the society more resilient. You said, Mr. Ambassador, that the people believe stupidities. Yeah, maybe we should do something to decrease the number of people who believe stupidities. We had a fake news about the Czech candidate for the president, Mr. Pavel, the day before elections. The fake news was that he is dead. It's similar to your story. So he showed himself. I am the witness. He is alive. I spoke to him a few days ago. But even though he showed himself in the public, hundreds of people saw him in a public place, there were people who kept believing that Pavel is dead. Yeah, so education, awareness raising, some campaign that the people could look at the facts, because we want much more fact-checking and labeling of this information. This is what I didn't say. The people should have a choice. If you want to believe the stupid disinformation or dangerous disinformation, yes, I cannot change it, because we have all tendency to believe what we want to believe. something psychological. But we should offer them the facts. And this is the work for the fact checkers, for the journalists. I am really pushing the big platforms to invest also in capacities of fact checkers so that there is, I wanted to say, alternative truth provided.
Don't.
Forget it. It will be cut and abused. No, I believe that the people should have a first-hand available the facts. And by the way, this was what Twitter did when Trump, before the elections, spread the disinformation about the electoral system, the correspondence voting. It was a lie. And so
one of thousands.
they labeled it. They labeled it, and they delivered the facts. It was not censorship, it was labeling. While when Trump was inciting for protests, which led to Capitol, they removed it. And that's the difference which the president also described. We have to differentiate, and we are strictly differentiating also in EU legislation at the illegal content, which is clear-cut cases of hate speech, terrorism, extremism, and child pornography, and disinformation, which is legal but harmful content and which requires more subtle reaction, because still, I hope it will remain, our main principle is the protection of the freedom of speech.
Gospod ambasador, nekateri trdijo, da je problem.
Mr. Ambassador, some claim that the problem that Russia has with Ukraine has nothing to do with the trade agreements with the EU and Ukraine's desire to become a NATO member. They say that instead, the essence of the problem is democracy in Ukraine, a democratic country bordering Russia. Now, during the times of war, I believe that this is impossible to measure, but can you tell us what is the atmosphere between the Ukrainians? We know that the EU is solid, but we have seen some cracks in terms of support in some EU member countries. How about Ukraine? What is the atmosphere? Are there any cracks in how people feel?
Well, first of all, I'd like to express my personal gratitude and my official gratitude to all the EU countries which supported us, and specifically to Slovenia, because we really feel this level of support, including the support in the sphere of fighting with the disinformation. I gave a bad example or successful example for Russians of their disinformation, and I would like to give another example of successful fighting against disinformation. Russia put a picture, a photo of Slovenia nuclear power plant as an evidence that Ukrainians are developing dirty bomb. Immediately, Slovenia reacted. They found that this is our Slovenian nuclear plant, and it is great evidence that we need fact-checking, as Madam Vice President said. And speaking to answer your question, this aggression allows Ukrainians, gave us great opportunity to unite together. We are united as previously we didn't were. Doesn't matter from which part of Ukraine you are. All Ukrainians understand the necessity to be united to fight against such a terrible aggression. All Ukrainians understand the necessity to be united to survive in this terrible war. And we have differences in languages. Some people speak Russian, some people speak Ukrainian. More and more people speak Ukrainian language nowadays. At the same time, I was in trenches as the front line, and there is no difference at all. Whatever language you speak, the most important thing is you fight for Ukraine. There, people, soldiers, do not ask each other, where are you from? Oh, you're from Western Ukraine. Oh, you're from Eastern Ukraine. From Lugansk, from Donetsk, wherever. The most important thing is we are Ukrainians, we are fighting for Ukraine. So I believe that after the victory, we will be united as never previously. Thank you.
Jaz imam še cel kup vprašanj.
Well, I have a lot of further questions. However, I would like to open the floor for the questions from the audience. First of all, I would like to ask a question that we received online. You can use the Slido application to ask your question using the hashtag #FactsMatter. So I will read the question because it's in English. I don't want that anybody...
Se pravi, gre takole. EU banned the Russian media at the beginning of the war. Do you think we don't have a right to know what the other side of propaganda says? Can't we do selection? Who wants to, please?
Yes, we sanctioned Russia Today and Sputnik first because they were owned by or established by the Russian regime, which is the war aggressor, which is sanctioned regime. And the second, because it was owned by the sanctioned person. So this was the main reason. The secondary reason was the content, but we are keeping with this sanctioning logic. And no, we don't think we should remain naive. And we should let Russian war regime to abuse the freedom of speech in the EU. And it has some limits. And I have to say that I was criticized for this decision, especially in Germany, in some Western countries. I even got a question whether we are not giving Putin a wrong example, that we are imposing censorship on their media. So Putin is doing the same to Western media and chasing out of the country. I think it was 𝗷𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗃. And I couldn't believe my ears. Does Putin really need our example to introduce the worst ever censorship regime with putting people for 15 years to jail for what they are saying? This is, I think we have to also fight against this kind of naivism and lack of understanding what Putin's regime is. So this is temporary. This is something which will not last forever. But we had to react on changing of media into the pure Russian propagandist weapons. I wanted to say something more.
Imam podvprašanje.
I have a sub-question for you. Radio Free Russia is your project. Many Russian journalists have left the country because, according to them, it is impossible for them to report about the war from the country. And I read that there are many of them in the Netherlands. What is the ambition of this project?
Yeah, don't imagine establishing a radio with a seat and with the newsroom. It's rather a platform which should help the Russian journalists which are on different places in the EU to have to gain some status which will enable them to stay in Europe. Different member states have different approach. In some states they receive humanitarian visa, in some other states working permit. There is high level of uncertainty, so I would like to harmonize without the legal competence. We don't have competence to do that, but I'd like to have some agreement with the member states that there will be some harmonized approach to give them certainty regarding their status. The second thing, they need to have some financial certainty, so I will I'm looking for some injections, some financial support, which should be accompanied by also private money and fundraising. I think that this is important, that they have some material basis. This platform will also invite the big media houses, which should give them jobs and possibility to work. Typically, the Dutch DPG media house is offering their space and their support to 3 Russian media. And so this is the material and financial conditions which should improve through this platform. And the third thing is to find the technological means how to deliver the content to Russia. We are working on all 3. The Radio Free Russia is the project which should help to deliver the content to Russia in the course of several months.
Ja, jaz sem želela samo dodati glede blokade Sputnika.
I just wanted to add something with regard to the blockage of Sputnik and Russia today. I am well known in Slovenia as a fighter for the freedom of speech. Do not forget that only 2 most obnoxious media were blocked. The 2 media outlets were conducting such a propaganda that it was recognized as hybrid warfare. Today, you can find 𝗚𝗏 on the internet in Slovenia. Many other Russian portals are available. So it is not true that the EU blocked information from Russia in its entirety. We are only talking about Russia Today and Sputnik. And for me, it is absolutely clear, as soon as the war started, I followed the events, and I agreed wholeheartedly with the decision of the EU to make this first step. Let us be aware of this, that the war nowadays is no longer just tanks and bombs. I am talking also about the Supreme Commander of the Slovenian Armed Forces. Nowadays, we have hybrid warfare, and this is a part of warfare that needs our attention. And if you allow me, Natasha, Mrs. Vice President mentioned the 𝗀𝗏𝗃 team. This is even worse than Cambridge Analytica. It is a part of hybrid warfare of third countries who are trying to influence the election results in those countries that they don't particularly like. For instance, if there is the right client with the right amount of money, then the Israeli team can act. This is a top-notch team, and there were journalists who infiltrated themselves in this company, which work with robots, which use real live photos. They have bank accounts opened. This is really very sophisticated. It's hard to believe. And Tal Hanani, the head of the company, told these infiltrated journalists, without knowing that they received orders to influence elections in 33 countries of the world, and that they were successful in 27 countries of the world. This is an example of how to influence democracy in other countries. Let's not forget that. Does anybody have a question among the audience? Please wait for the microphone, introduce yourselves, and tell us who the question is for. This is a question for Madam Vice President, you mentioned problems caused by disinformation, hate speech from third countries, and you said that we must fight against this. I would like to know what is your opinion, how to approach this, how to approach when this is being used by the political parties within the country. I'm not talking about Slovenia. Mrs. Jourová mentioned Mr. Babiš, for instance. But these are problems for society. They modify society in a negative way. So I think if we fight this in third countries, then the EU must fight against this also on its own territory. Thank you for the question. I absolutely agree with you. I will be very frank. Media bear a huge share of responsibility, and I'm afraid that in Slovenia, media are not aware enough about this responsibility, about the responsibility of how to process content received from the political parties. I would like to see an increase in accountability in this respect. Perhaps the time has come to make clear distinctions about how to regulate ownership in the media. I would ban political parties and politicians to own media. I would simply ban it. And with regard to the European Media Freedom Act, and Mrs. Vice President will complement what I'm saying, this has also been discussed. You have raised a very complex question. The accountability of politicians is great, how they will communicate with the media, with the voters, because at the end of the day, the voters will recognize the values, and this is a political fight, a political duel. Someone who misuses disinformation or information in order to gain elections. I think that there are enough smart people in our country who will not vote such politicians. Of course, people are naive, and Madam Vice President mentioned this naivety. But we must make sure to reduce such negative excesses to the minimum. Microphone, please. Can we use the same tools for one side and the other? Well, to use military terminology, double use must be available. So we must be able to fight disinformation from the third countries to the EU, but at the same time, we must have the same tools available to fight disinformation within the EU. Disinformation is present in every country. Slovenia is no exception. I will continue with a question that we received via the internet, and this time it is really for the Vice President.
What can we expect from European Media Freedom Act? Is Media Freedom Act magic pill for all the problems in media and journalism in Europe?
I would love to have such power to come with the magic law which will solve all the problems. Of course not. The Media Freedom Act, in my view, is necessary for the EU because we see a very dangerous tendency of worsening situation for media in almost all the member states. And you just spoke about the indispensable role and responsibility of media in democratic world. So we found it necessary to propose a law which should protect the media better. So this is not the law which is regulating media, but the space for media and the conditions for media to do the job. There is a strong chapter on public service media, which is quite topical in Slovenia. And I will discuss today with the Minister of Culture also about the media law. The Media Freedom Act has to work well together with the Digital Services Act, because in the Digital Services Act we give quite strong power to the platforms and digital players when it comes to moderation of content. And we owe to the traditional media to defend their content against the power of the platforms. So it's also good to realize this connection. I promised to European media and to several influential media organizations in the EU that we will adopt the law, the media law, which will protect the media more. But I wanted something from them. I wanted them to increase the standards, the ethical standards, the transparency of ownership of media, the transparency of financing, because it is a very fair game, I guess. We will protect you better, but you also have to do something on your side. And I have high expectations that there will be a stronger movement in the media world towards the higher quality, because one of the reasons why the media are under attack now in some places in the EU is that also we see that the people do not trust too much the media in some countries. And when something is not trusted, then it's easy to attack it. Yeah? So that's why I am really in a very vibrant discussion with the media organizations and asking them to increase the trust through increasing ethical standards and professionalism.
Hvala lepa. Mislim, da smo imeli tam še eno vprašanje. Še 5 minut imamo, potem pa bomo morali zaključiti.
I think we had another question. We have 5 minutes left and then we have to conclude. And I apologize because we will probably not be able to answer all the questions. I have a piece of information and 2 comments. My name is Dragan Barbotovski, Head of Strategic Communication at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But I represent an informal group of strategic communicators. We are trying to establish a formal group combating disinformation coming from abroad. We are fully aware that it is about national security, and this is why we have accelerated our efforts. We are going to come up with a model or several models for decision makers so that this group can be positioned somewhere in the public administration. We already work with the EU and NATO, but what is new will be the Slovenian structure that we would like to introduce to the Slovenian decision makers. Our principle will be resilience of the entire society, so we will be dealing with media literacy, raising the awareness, working with the media. So that is just for your information. We are going to involve data analysis experts and also strategic communicators. Madam Commissioner, I am very pleased to say or to hear that you are talking to platforms. The problem that we have with disinformation, hate speech, is that Twitter, Facebook don't speak Slovenian, and that's the problem that we have when removing the contents from the platforms. And finally, I am also very pleased to see that Mr. Ambassador noticed our campaign. We, strategic communicators, have learned a lot, and this is the basis on which we are building our model to combat disinformation. Oh, thank you very much. I would just like to give you the floor for some final words, Madam Commissioner.
Ki smo ga dobili, in sicer Slovenija fell on World Press Freedom Index to 54th place. Last 2 years, especially public media services, are struggling with political pressure. How do you see the situation in the media here in Slovenia and on public broadcaster RTV Slovenia, where journalists report they are under pressure?
Yes, I want to say 3 things. First of all, I am very glad that the situation of the Slovenian press agency has been solved, because it was not a star moment for Slovenia when the press agency had to go for the crowdfunding. I think that the public service media should have sufficient and reliable funding from the state as public service media. The situation of the TV I cannot comment because as well as you are, I am waiting for the decision of the Constitutional Court. So we will see. I would only say that in each member state, the role of the public TV is absolutely key. We see in the countries where there is not so much public TV, but more state TV or party TV paid from public money, that it doesn't have a good influence on elections, without naming, but we can imagine. And the third thing, I will speak to the Minister of Culture about the financial situation of the press, of the printed media, regional and local media, because I received an information that the situation is very, very difficult. So without any pushing, I will just ask whether there is some plan to help. I have to honestly admit that the Media Freedom Act tries to solve many things and increase the protection of media, but is not solving the financial and economic pressure on media. This has not happened. This is not a very positive end to admit that we didn't manage something. After so many years in politics, I should learn to do better. Thank you.
Gospa predsednica, če dovolite mogoče iztočnico za vas, za zaključno besedo. V vlogi odvetnice ste zagovarjali novinarji, pomagali.
Madam President, you will have the final word. You used to be a journalist. Now you are the president and combating disinformation. What is going to be your role? Well, as the president, and given the competencies that I have, I am fully aware that my biggest competency is the power of my words. I am always going to speak up whenever necessary. Now, speaking about disinformation, I find it very difficult to accept that people are trying to put people in bubbles in the public media. So in journalism, we should not have people who are ours and those who are yours. We should not have journalists who belong to the left of the right side. I want to hear that we have professional journalists. If somebody is not ours, that doesn't mean that he or she is not a professional journalist. And the idea to have one channel who is more left-oriented and to have a second channel who is more right-oriented, that's not a good idea. This is what they used to do on RAI, the Italian television. That's not a good idea. We don't want to have channel 1, which is for people who are right-oriented, and channel 2, who is for people who are left-oriented. In this way, you are going to create 2 bubbles. You are going to label journalists, even if they were not labeled before. And in addition to that, people are only going to see the media which is dedicated for them. Well, try to check ChatGPT. if you go on Bing, you will find it. I must say that combating disinformation, I have quite a lot of trust in artificial intelligence. But ChatGPT is not going to help you, really. It's slightly arrogant. And I asked it, who is Nataša Briški? And the reply was that I am Minister of Justice. And then I asked back, are you sure? And he said, no, sorry, you're not. And then I received my CV. So quite interesting. My colleague in the office was set to be president of the Constitutional Court. So you should not trust blindly that ChatGPT or Bing is going to tell you all. So please listen to the daily podcast. There is somebody who talked to Bing an entire night, and at the end of the day, he found that he was trying to charm him. He said, my name is Sydney, but then the guy responded, well, I'm married. And the reply from the bot was, but you are not happy in your marriage. So be careful, follow technologies, reverse image on Google, check a photo. Is it the true photo or is it a fake photo? You carry a big responsibility. The media have a huge responsibility to carry. Also politicians, but politics is a different game. But you have a very big responsibility. Mr. Ambassador, you have the final word.
And I'd like one more time to thank you for being here. And I want to tell you how successful is our struggle, our fight against Russian disinformation. The very first thing Russian troops do when they occupy whatever village, whatever city, is to eliminate any possibility to listen to Ukrainian news, to listen to world news. They cut all the hubs which were broadcasting international news and Ukrainian news. They start using from the very beginning, after the occupation, whatever place, they start broadcasting their own news. That means, in my understanding, they are really afraid of the truth, what's going on. They are really afraid of our efforts to eliminate the lies and disinformation they are trying to produce, they are trying to disperse. So it shows we are successful in the fight with the information, but we should be very careful in the future. We should continue our efforts to fight the information, and we should find proper ways, legitimate ways to fight with the information. Thank you.
Hvala lepa tudi vam, gospod ambasador.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Madam Vice President Jourová, and thank you, Minister of Justice. Thank you very much for participating in this debate, and all the best.